A tribal widow was trading her beaded necklace until a rancher did something unexpected. Ayanna Redbird stepped into the trading post with the beaded strands resting against her palm. She understood that survival was asking her to surrender the last piece of herself that had not already been taken. The necklace had belonged to her mother, stitched by hand during a winter when stories were stronger than storms, and every bead carried memory, language, and lineage. Yet the trader behind the counter did not see history. He saw exchange value, and as he examined it with indifferent fingers, Ayanna felt the quiet fracture of choosing between pride and bread. Everyone in town believed she would eventually break, except the rancher who was watching the trade unfold without blinking. Samuel Briggs stood near the doorway, having come for supplies, and he recognized the look on her face not as desperation, but as calculation, the kind that comes when someone is trying to measure how much of themselves they can afford to lose without disappearing entirely. The trader named a price far below what the craftsmanship deserved, and Ayanna did not argue, because arguing required power she did not possess, and when she extended the necklace across the counter, her hand remained steady even as something inside her tightened. Samuel did not interrupt immediately, because interference in other people's transactions often invited trouble, and this town had already decided how much dignity it was willing to grant a tribal widow. Yet as he watched the beads slide across the wood toward a man who saw them only as profit, he felt something settle into place, not sympathy, but decision. Before the trader could close his fingers around the necklace, Samuel stepped forward and placed double the offered amount on the counter without negotiation, and the room shifted in quiet confusion, because generosity in this town rarely arrived without conditions. He did not look at the trader when he spoke. He looked at Ayanna, and he told her to keep the necklace, that no memory should be priced below its meaning, and the simplicity of his words unsettled the silence more than an argument would have. The trader protested, suggesting that charity blurred lines best left intact, and Samuel replied evenly that he was not buying the necklace, he was buying time. And as the beads returned to Ayanna's hand instead of disappearing into the register drawer, she understood with sudden clarity that the rancher had not merely interrupted a sale, he had altered the direction of her survival. And in a town where boundaries were rarely crossed without consequence, Samuel Briggs had just stepped across one in full view of everyone watching. The room did not erupt into argument, because this town preferred its discomfort quiet, yet the shift in air was unmistakable. And as Ayanna closed her fingers around the necklace again, she felt every eye measuring what had just happened, not as kindness, but as disruption. Samuel did not linger to explain himself. He collected his supplies and stepped aside, leaving the trader to gather the coins from the counter with a reluctance that bordered on resentment. And Ayanna understood that whatever the rancher had purchased, it was not silence. Outside the trading post, the street carried the usual sounds of hooves and wagons, yet she felt the weight of something altered, because people were not looking at her as they had before. They were looking at the space between her and Samuel, as if a line had been drawn that they did not know how to interpret. She followed him out, not because she expected more, but because unanswered acts feel heavier than insult, and when she reached him near the hitching post, she asked why he had done it, her voice calm but edged with pride, because she would not allow the moment to become pity disguised as generosity. Samuel met her gaze steadily and told her he had not bought her necklace, and he had not bought her loyalty, that he had simply refused to watch a memory traded for survival at a discount, and the distinction mattered more than the money. Ayanna studied him carefully because she had lived long enough to know that favors often return as debts, and she told him plainly that she would repay him, not in gratitude but in fairness. And Samuel nodded once, saying repayment was not required today, but dignity always was, and that she would not find him standing in her way if she chose differently tomorrow. The simplicity of his tone unsettled her more than obligation would have, because he had not claimed ownership of her hardship or tied her future to his act. And for a brief moment she felt the unfamiliar steadiness of someone being treated as equal rather than charity. Across the street, two men spoke low enough to avoid direct confrontation, but loud enough to carry implication, remarking that mixing business with sentiment rarely ended cleanly, and Samuel heard them but did not respond because he understood that protest would only deepen suspicion. As Ayanna turned to leave, she sensed the trader watching her differently now, not with indifference but with calculation, because interference had raised the value of what he had almost taken. And she realized that the necklace was no longer just memory. It was a symbol that had publicly challenged the town's quiet hierarchy. When she walked away with the beads still resting against her chest, she understood that the rancher had not merely stopped a transaction. He had exposed something fragile in the town's order, and fragile structures often react with force when questioned. And though she did not know what would follow, she sensed that Samuel Briggs had not finished altering her path. He had only begun it. Ayanna did not return directly to her cabin after leaving the trading post, because she understood that walking away too quickly would make her appear shaken, and she refused to grant the town the satisfaction of reading her thoughts. Yet the weight of what had happened followed her down the road like a second shadow, and she knew that the interruption at the counter had changed more than her immediate survival. It had made her visible in a way she had carefully avoided. Samuel did not ride beside her or attempt conversation in public view, but as she reached the narrow trail that led toward the edge of town, she heard his horse approach at a measured pace, neither hurried nor hesitant, and she felt the familiar tension rise in her chest, because visibility often precedes complication. He stopped a short distance away and told her calmly that winter would not grow kinder in the coming weeks, that trading heirlooms would only delay what needed more stable ground, and that he had work at his ranch that required steady hands rather than sacrifice. And though his words were practical, the offer beneath them carried risk for both of them. Ayanna turned toward him fully then, her posture composed, and asked whether he was offering employment or protection, because the difference mattered more than the money he had placed on the counter earlier, and Samuel answered that he was offering work, nothing more and nothing less, and that if she chose to accept it, the necklace would remain where it belonged. The clarity of his response unsettled her, because he had anticipated her suspicion and refused to exploit it. And for a moment she allowed herself to imagine what steady wages might mean. Not dependence, but breathing space. Not rescue, but structure. Across the ridge, two men who had witnessed the scene at the trading post slowed their horses, watching the exchange with narrowed eyes, and Ayanna recognized the look immediately, the one that measured deviation from expected roles, and she understood that accepting the rancher's offer would not go unnoticed. Samuel sensed it too, because he shifted slightly in his saddle, not defensively but deliberately, and told her that work at his ranch would not come with apology, that if she agreed, she would be treated as any other hired hand. And the statement carried weight precisely because it refused to romanticize her hardship. Ayanna felt the familiar pull between caution and survival, because trust had rarely served her well in this town, yet hunger had already demanded sacrifice once, and she would not allow it to demand memory again. And as she studied Samuel's expression, she saw neither pity nor desire, only resolve. When she finally nodded, the movement was small but decisive, and she told him she would begin at first light. And as he tipped his hat without ceremony and turned his horse toward the fields, she sensed the ripple of consequence spreading quietly through the town behind her, because employment between worlds rarely remains simple. And she understood with steady clarity that the necklace resting against her collarbone was no longer just heritage. It was a line drawn in full daylight, and stepping across it would change more than her circumstances. She arrived at the ranch before sunrise, not because she feared being late, but because she refused to be the subject of speculation on her first morning. And as she stepped through the gate with the pale light stretching across the pasture, she felt the quiet weight of beginning something that the town had not sanctioned. Samuel was already in the yard, adjusting tack and checking feed, and he did not greet her with ceremony, only a nod that carried expectation rather than surprise, and she understood immediately that whatever place she would earn here would be built through work, not sentiment. He assigned her tasks without hesitation, sorting supplies, preparing feed, mending torn canvas, and though none were glamorous, each carried trust, because they required access to the rhythm of his operation rather than confinement to its edges. The ranch hands watched her cautiously at first, their glances not hostile but uncertain, because her presence represented more than employment. It represented a shift in the invisible rules that had long governed who belonged where. And Ayanna felt the scrutiny without reacting to it, focusing instead on precision, on moving with quiet efficiency that required no defense. By midday, the first small shift occurred, not dramatic enough to announce itself, but steady enough to notice, when one of the younger hands asked her how she had learned to stitch leather so tightly, and she answered simply that beadwork teaches patience before beauty. And the explanation bridged something subtle between them, because craftsmanship speaks across language more easily than politics. Samuel observed from a distance, not intervening, not defending, allowing her competence to speak louder than any declaration he could make, and in that restraint, she recognized respect more clearly than protection. Yet, as the afternoon stretched on, a rider appeared at the fence, one of the men who had whispered at the trading post, and he watched the yard with an expression that carried neither curiosity nor friendliness, and Ayanna felt the familiar tightening in her chest, because labor does not erase prejudice, it only challenges it. When the rider finally called out to Samuel, suggesting that mixing traditions might invite trouble, Samuel answered calmly that trouble rarely came from steady hands and honest work, and the response was simple enough to sound neutral, yet firm enough to refuse retreat. The rider lingered only a moment longer before turning back toward town. But Ayanna sensed the message had already been delivered, that her employment would not remain a quiet matter for long. And as she finished securing the last stack of feed and felt the necklace rest warm against her skin, she understood that the ranch had not merely given her wages, it had given her visibility backed by structure, and in a town that guarded its hierarchy carefully, visible change often triggered reaction. And she realized that the true test would not be whether she could work beside Samuel Briggs, but whether the town would tolerate what that partnership implied once it grew too steady to dismiss. The warning arrived at dusk, because towns prefer to deliver pressure when the day's work is nearly finished, and fatigue weakens resolve. And as Ayanna was washing her hands at the pump near the barn, she saw 3 riders approach with deliberate calm, their horses slowing not out of hesitation, but control. And she recognized immediately that this was not casual visitation. Samuel stepped forward before they dismounted, his posture relaxed but immovable, and the men spoke without raising their voices, explaining that some townsfolk were unsettled by the arrangement, that lines between communities existed for stability, and that stability was good for business and peace alike. Ayanna listened without interrupting, because she understood that these conversations were rarely about the person in question. They were about preserving the comfort of those who felt threatened by change. And when one of the men suggested that perhaps she might find employment among her own people, instead, the phrasing was gentle but the meaning unmistakable. Samuel did not escalate the tone. He simply asked whether work performed well had suddenly become unacceptable based on origin, and the question lingered in the air heavier than accusation would have, because it forced them to confront the absence of practical fault. The men shifted slightly, speaking now of perception rather than prejudice, of how visibility could invite unrest, and Ayanna felt the familiar tension return, the instinct to withdraw before conflict sharpened. But she did not step back, because the ranch had already become a place where retreat felt like surrender rather than strategy. She told them calmly that she had not come to disrupt the town, only to earn her bread without surrendering memory, and that the necklace at her collar was not a symbol of division, but of survival. And for a moment, uncertainty crossed one man's face, because dignity spoken plainly unsettles those expecting apology. Samuel added quietly that if stability required excluding honest labor, then perhaps the town's definition of peace needed reconsideration. And though his voice remained level, the implication was unmistakable. He would not trade fairness for comfort. The riders eventually mounted again, offering no threat but no concession either. And as they rode away, dust rising behind them, Ayanna felt the weight of consequence settle more clearly than before, because warnings rarely conclude a matter. They prepare for escalation. Samuel turned toward her and said nothing about leaving or compromise, and in that silence she recognized something steadier than protection. Alignment, not imposed, but chosen. As twilight deepened and the ranch returned to its rhythm, she understood that what had begun as a small interruption at a trading counter had now grown into a quiet challenge to the town's hierarchy. And challenges, once acknowledged publicly, rarely fade on their own. The test came not with accusation, but with absence, because the following week several regular buyers failed to appear at the ranch, supply wagons arrived late without explanation, and a contract Samuel had relied on for years was suddenly under reconsideration. And though no one spoke her name directly, Ayanna understood that consequence had shifted from warning to action. Samuel read the notices with the same steady expression he wore when mending fence wire in wind, yet she noticed the subtle tightening in his jaw, the calculation behind his calm. And she felt the weight of her presence press heavier against the stability he had built long before she stepped through his gate. That evening she approached him while he was checking feed, telling him plainly that she would leave before becoming the reason his livelihood fractured, and the words cost her more than the necklace ever had, because this time the sacrifice would not be memory, but belonging. Samuel looked at her for a long moment before answering that leaving would not restore anything. It would only teach the town that pressure reshapes principle, and that he had not chosen to stand beside her for convenience, but because it was right, and right does not become negotiable when tested. The clarity in his tone unsettled her more than reassurance would have, because it removed the illusion that her departure could simplify matters, and she realized that what bound them now was not obligation, but shared resolve. The following morning, instead of retreating, Samuel rode into town with her beside him, not hidden in the barn or kept at the ranch, but seated visibly in the wagon, as they stopped first at the merchant who had delayed supplies. And in the quiet of the store, he stated calmly that if business required him to abandon fairness, he would find other routes beyond town lines. The merchant hesitated, because losing Samuel's steady trade would wound more than accommodating it, and Ayanna sensed the subtle shift in balance, because when principle becomes expensive, it also becomes persuasive. By midday, word spread that Samuel Briggs had refused to retract his decision, and though some men muttered about defiance, others began to reconsider whether isolating a reliable rancher served anyone's interest, and the fragile unity of prejudice began to show its cracks. As they rode back toward the ranch, Ayanna felt the steady warmth of the necklace resting against her skin, no longer a symbol of what she might lose, but of what she had chosen to protect. And she understood that the town's test had revealed something unexpected, that resistance rooted in dignity does not collapse easily, and that sometimes the greater shock is not an act of mercy, but the refusal to reverse it when challenged. The town did not gather for a reckoning, Because change in small places rarely arrives with ceremony. It arrives through reluctant adjustments, and within days the merchant resumed regular shipments. Contracts quietly returned to their original terms, and the riders who had once delivered warnings now passed the ranch without stopping, because pressure that fails to bend a man eventually begins to lose its shape. Ayanna noticed the shift not in words, but in posture. Fewer narrowed glances, fewer whispered calculations, and more measured nods that carried the subtle acknowledgement that her presence had not disrupted the ranch, it had strengthened it. Samuel did not declare victory or satisfaction. He simply continued the work as he always had, allowing consistency to replace confrontation, and in that steadiness she recognized something deeper than defense. It was partnership. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the fields, casting long amber light across the pasture, Samuel approached her near the fence where she was repairing tack, and he told her plainly that the ranch no longer needed to justify her presence, that she had earned her place not as exception, but as equal. The words settled quietly between them, free of spectacle, and Ayanna felt the distance between survival and belonging finally narrow into something whole. She told him that when she first entered the trading post with the necklace in her hand, she believed losing it was the cost of staying alive. And he answered that survival built on erasing oneself was only another form of disappearance. And she understood then that what he had interrupted that day was not merely a transaction, but a surrender. In the weeks that followed, the ranch hands no longer watched her with uncertainty, but with familiarity. And the town, though imperfect in its transformation, adjusted its narrative from suspicion to reluctant respect, because steadiness over time reshapes memory more effectively than argument. One morning at dawn, as they stood side by side overlooking the fields they now worked together, Samuel reached for her hand, not as rescuer, but as companion, and she accepted not out of gratitude but choice, because this life was no longer something granted to her. It was something she had built. The necklace rested against her collarbone, warm in the rising sun, not as a relic of what she almost lost, but as proof that heritage and future could exist in the same space without negotiation. And as the light spread across the land, Ayanna realized that the most unexpected act had not been the rancher placing money on a counter, but the refusal to step back when tested. And in that refusal she had found not charity, but love rooted in respect. And this time, the morning belonged to them both. She was ready to trade her last memory for bread. Would you have stepped in, or stayed silent like the rest of the town? If this story meant something to you, like the video, share it with someone who values quiet strength, and subscribe to Echoes of a Rancher for more stories of love, redemption, and survival.